to nuclear power generation in Australia, and I now welcome Dr. Aubard, Ms. Cook and Mr. Parker to give evidence today. For the Hansard record, would you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee? And we'll start with you, Mr. Aubard.
Hi, my name's Edward Aubard and I'm representing myself.
Helen Cook, and I appear in a personal capacity.
Thank you.
Mr. Robert Parker, and I'm here as founder of Nuclear for Climate Australia.
Thank you. This hearing is a legal proceeding of the Parliament. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Before I invite you to make a brief opening statement, then we proceed to discussions. Would you please state if you are a current or former member of a political party or a union or an investor in the renewable or nuclear industries? Mr. Aubard.
I'm not.
Thank you. Ms. Cook.
I am not, but I am a former non-executive director of Silex Systems, an Australian company developing uranium enrichment technology, and I'm the owner of G&E Advisory, a law firm that services the international nuclear community.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm a former member of the Australian Labor Party, endorsed candidate for the seat of Goulburn.
Well, very good. Thank you, Mr. Parker. And now I invite you to all make a brief opening statement. I'll start with you, Mr. Aubard.
Thank you. So I'm the director of the UNSW Nuclear Innovation Centre, which is a group of 40 UNSW academics and their collaborators working to build responsible and effective nuclear capacity in Australia. This year, roughly 150 students took advanced nuclear engineering courses at UNSW as part of undergraduate, postgraduate and research degrees. Since the start of the 21st century, global fossil fuel use has risen relentlessly from 90,000 terawatt-hours per year to 140,000 terawatt-hours per year, which is an increase of over 50%. The only dips in carbon emissions occurred during the GFC and the COVID pandemic. And you can see in the two figures I've given you that the atmospheric CO2 concentration is not only increasing, but it's increasing faster as time goes by. On the right, you can see the global primary energy consumption. Last year, humanity collectively installed more renewable capacity and burned more coal, more oil and more gas than we have ever before. So the notion of a so-called energy transition, either in the past or in the future, results from a simplistic and wrong interpretation of history. The numbers simply do not support it. Current policy pretends that by making the right consumer choices, the right policy incentives, we can invert the colours in the graph on the right and then rotate the graph on the left clockwise by 90 degrees. In the next 30 years, I consider this dream to be dangerously unrealistic. Soon, as a society, we will have to confront the horrible reckoning that the energy transition has failed. Hopefully, before that day, our energy planners and government will realistically prepare us for the next 100 to 150 years of human history that will follow. This future is unlikely to resemble the present. Deglobalization, supply shocks, natural disasters, even war are realistic events through which our energy systems must keep working. We must both mitigate and adapt to climate change to survive, and the future of Australia depends on this. In a context of very high risks and uncertainties and probable loss of life and livelihoods, it is unconscionable that a developed country like Australia should rule out a whole class of the most powerful zero-emissions energy technology. We must take all possible steps to use nuclear energy and continue to develop renewables. Nuclear energy is expensive. Building nuclear power plants takes years. This is not contested. We should have started 20 years ago. It does not mean we can't start now. Small fractions of nuclear power lower the overall cost of a zero-emissions energy system because it reduces the need for overcapacity and poorly utilised storage in other areas. To compare nuclear to renewables is a false choice, and in fact nothing more than a clever way to procrastinate and delay the reckoning that I describe. The greatest challenge of using nuclear energy is developing the skills pipeline and community of expertise. At the UNSW Nuclear Innovation Centre, we are already working with trusted partners in the UK and USA to grow a skilled and expert nuclear workforce. We must not be irked by the mention of nuclear energy in research agreements when our allies are openly exploiting its civilian benefits, and we should help them to do this because everyone's CO2 goes into the same atmosphere. At UNSW, our engineering faculty numbers approximately 22,000 people, and you will find that most young scientists and engineers are remarkably open to all forms of nuclear technology and will share an outlook something like I have presented to you today. It goes without saying that the UNSW Nuclear Innovation Centre is here to help, and you are welcome to visit us one day, and I would be happy to try and answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Obard. Ms. Cook, Dr. Obard, sorry, Ms. Cook.
Thank you. I'm an Australian and US qualified lawyer. I lived overseas for 13 years, including 9 in Washington, DC. And I've practiced in the global nuclear energy sector now for almost 17 years, both within the nuclear energy practices of large international law firms, as well as through my own Australian-based law firm. I've advised governments and government agencies on different aspects of nuclear program development and implementation, and I currently work on large nuclear construction procurement and construction projects, as well as working on the demonstration projects for small modular reactors. I firmly believe that the backbone of the world's future decarbonised energy system will need to be nuclear energy. In addition to the 32 countries utilising nuclear energy today, more than 50 countries are at various stages of actively considering nuclear or implementing new programs. Of course, countries close to home already have nuclear energy, such as China, South Korea and Japan. And many countries in our region have very active nuclear energy programs. These include the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Vietnam and Singapore. All other countries in the G20 utilise nuclear energy, are able to access it from neighbours or are actively developing nuclear power programs. For those that don't have nuclear today in the G20, Turkey has its first reactor in commissioning, Saudi Arabia is actively procuring large reactors, Indonesia is developing its nuclear energy program, and Italy has signalled a return to nuclear energy. Together with Australia, that leaves Germany, which of course neighbours France and can import electricity, and France generates about 70% of its electricity from its 56 nuclear reactors. Since coming home to Australia and in the context of my day-to-day work overseas, I'm concerned that our country is increasingly out of step with other industrialised countries and countries in our region. However, in my professional opinion, Australia is one of the best, if not the best placed country in the world to move ahead expeditiously and responsibly to implement a nuclear energy program. With sufficient political will, I believe the Coalition's policy of seeing the first reactor come online in 10 to 12 years is achievable. I have a front row seat to many of the challenges faced by the nuclear sector globally. But in assessing the viability of nuclear energy in Australia, specifically in reference to timelines, I need to address the remarks of Ms Claire Savage, Chair of the Australian Energy Regulator, when she said that it will take 8 to 10 years just to get the regulatory framework in place, and only after that can you proceed to construct reactors. I fundamentally disagree with this assessment. Ms Savage's comments appear to demonstrate a lack of understanding of 2 important factors. First, the existing status of Australia's legal and regulatory infrastructure for nuclear. Australia is already a contracting party to all the recommended treaties and conventions that a nuclear nation should have in place. And we implement our obligations in existing nuclear laws. We have a law covering nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security, which is administered by the Australian Safeguards and Non-Proliferation Office. And in the area of nuclear safety, we also have a law which is the jurisdiction of the Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, or ARPANSA. So we have national laws and we have existing, internationally well-respected regulatory authorities. Focusing in on ARPANSA, ARPANSA has a regulatory framework developed and utilised for the licensing and oversight of the Opal Research Reactor. Importantly, this framework is non-prescriptive, goal-oriented, and ARPANSA is required by law to draw on international best practice. ARPANSA interprets that in large part to mean drawing on IAEA safety standards. These safety standards represent international consensus, and Australia actually sits on the IAEA's Commission on Safety Standards. Our CEO of ARPANSA is the representative on Australia on this commission. And just as they were for research reactors, these IAEA safety standards should be implemented into Australia's regulatory framework as they pertain to nuclear power. This is an important undertaking, but it is not necessarily a difficult one. This is an expansion of our existing framework, and it can be done quickly. The second flaw in the 8 to 10 year concept is the idea that the entire regulatory framework is needed on day one. It's not needed on day one. First, the regulator needs to be ready to receive a site licence application. Then it needs to be ready to receive a construction authorisation application. Then to oversee nuclear material arrival and commissioning and operations and so forth. The entire framework can be built up over time, and so too can the human resources necessary to implement it. A step-by-step approach is internationally accepted, and it's tried and tested. And to address one of the comments made by Simon Holmes à Court this morning, he's right that the civil works, those civil works that are not nuclear safety related, can be commenced in advance of the receipt by the licensee of a construction licence. They should be started in advance. And as soon as the EPBC Act environmental assessment is undertaken and an approval from our PANZA for the site preparation works is given, those works could be commenced. So there's no need to wait to develop the entire legal and regulatory framework, something that I believe is straightforward anyway. Projects can be initiated and the reactor licensing can be commenced. And indeed, it should be commenced using the IAEA's roadmap called the IAEA's Milestones Approach. And if implemented, this approach should see in a parallel fashion all the different tasks needed to implement a nuclear energy program undertaken together. And in doing so, Australia can be on the lower end of the IAEA's own assessment of 10 to 15 years from first policy consideration of nuclear energy in a newcomer country to first electrons on the grid. I will also note that the current GenCost report refers to the 2015 Milestones Approach document and suggests that the IAEA's numbers of 10 to 15 years should be updated to account for an increase in the construction period for nuclear power plants. However, the IAEA had the opportunity to consider this increased global average construction time because they released an update to that 2015 document this year. It was released in June 2024, and I was actually a contributor to this document, and the IAEA did not amend the 10 to 15 year timeline. I believe Australia is in an enviable position compared to other embarking countries, in large part due to our existing legal and regulatory infrastructure and our highly experienced existing regulatory bodies. So finally, I encourage the current government in the strongest possible terms to support the overturning of the prohibitions and to give Australians access to nuclear energy. I also implore the current government to stop diminishing our existing and highly competent nuclear industry and our highly competent and existing nuclear regulatory authorities. And I also implore the current government to stop the misinformation campaign with slogans of risky nuclear and images of fish with 3 eyes and cows with 2 heads. Quite frankly, it's embarrassing and it erodes our well-established international credibility. But more importantly, it's also a disservice to the Australian people who want and deserve accurate information around all sources of energy generation, including nuclear. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms Cook. Mr Parker.
I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to address them today, and I'm in support of nuclear energy. The National Electricity Objective, as stated in the National Electricity Law, requiring all states and jurisdictions to achieve net zero by 2050 can't be met, even for electricity production, unless a system based on high levels of nuclear energy is employed. The National Electricity Law is in direct conflict with the laws preventing nuclear energy production contained in the RPANZ and EPBC Acts. Systems based exclusively on wind, solar and hydro can't achieve deep decarbonisation because their embodied emissions are too high even before we add the burning of fossil fuels. It was reported in The Australian on the 13th of November 2024 by the Australian Energy Market Operators Chief Executive, Daniel Westerman, that natural gas will be the ultimate backstop for keeping the lights on, because weather-dependent generation can't deliver consistent power. He stated gas would be essential to secure the reliability of the eastern grid to 2050 and beyond, as the cost of trying to cover long periods of low wind and solar generation without it would be prohibitive. Westerman stated that we will have batteries, we will have pumped hydro, but we'll have times like we saw earlier this year, when there is not much wind and there's not much solar, not much sun, and the gas-fired power stations are really required to back up the reliability of the grid. They're there as the ultimate backstop. The failure of wind and solar to power our grid economically and achieve ultra-low emissions is due to high levels of embodied carbon, high random variability of weather patterns, and the collapse of capacity factors when wind and solar have very high penetration rates on the grid. These conclusions are supported by the very large amounts of materials required to deploy wind and solar, which are 4 to 5 times greater than those required by a nuclear-based system. Finally, it is entirely feasible and accords with precedents that the NEM can achieve true ultra-low emission electricity at half the cost of a system reliant on wind, solar and hydro and gas backup. Such a nuclear energy system would contain around 21 gigawatts of nuclear in 2050 and about 30 gigawatts in 2060. Such a nuclear energy system would The policy outlined by the Coalition is an excellent first step in this pathway, and it certainly could be implemented successfully to prove that Australia could install nuclear reactors successfully, and along the way we could cover off on proving that we could meet the administrative pieces, such as those described by Helen Cook. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr Kennedy first up.
Thank you, Chair. Ms Cook, I've just been doing a quick Google of you, and I just see you were the chair of the World Nuclear Association Law Working Group. That's very impressive. And I heard your testimony on Claire Savage, 8 to 10 years is not credible. What do you think is a credible timeline to set up a regulatory framework in Australia?
Thank you for the question. I believe that our PANZA could be ready to receive a construction licence application for a nuclear plant well within 3 years. And I believe that this committee has heard from international regulatory experts who believe the same as I do.
On timelines, we've heard a lot of conflicting evidence of timelines to build nuclear reactors. We've heard 20 plus years, 25 years. We've also heard at the other end, 7 reactors in 11 years. What do you think is credible that Australia should be looking to do in terms of the speed and scale of nuclear rollout if we embark on this policy?
So, thank you for raising the 7 reactors in 11-year question. I also heard that question asked and answered, and I think it does need to be addressed. So, in the next 10 to 12 years, I believe that it is possible to get 1 nuclear reactor up and running in Australia. There is a lead time, and that's real. But I believe that 10 to 12 year period to get the first reactor up and running is feasible. Is it possible in an 11-year period thereafter to see 7 reactors come online? I believe the answer to that question is absolutely, and that's exactly the program that we should be looking to implement, because that's one of the lessons learned from overseas and all of the historical experience of building nuclear reactors. If you build in a fleet approach, So you build the same technology over and over and over again. Time to build comes down and cost comes down. On your question of how long will it take to build sort of, the first reactor, that's an interesting question because, of course, we have the examples in the United States and Finland of projects that did go over budget and were well over the global average for nuclear builds. I think we need, and everyone who's familiar with those projects will appreciate that, and indeed Simon Holmes à Court I know knows this himself, that these projects were first of a kind projects. So they were the first demonstration of a new design after a period of not building new nuclear in the Western world, where we had atrophied supply chains, atrophied human resources, regulatory authorities that hadn't undergone licensing processes in quite some time. So I see these first projects as, if you like, doing the hard work for projects that are to come. And so with the tremendous momentum that I see around the world for the development of new nuclear projects, and the US government at COP29 just said it's going to have 200 gigawatt of new nuclear by 2050, 35 gigawatt of new nuclear by 2035. If we just take the AP1000, Westinghouse's technology, I think we will see a fleet rolled out in the United States. We know that they've got contracts to build in China, in Bulgaria, in Poland, in the Ukraine. They're shortlisted in Sweden, they're shortlisted in the Netherlands. So I think in about 5 years' time, we're going to see a very different world where we've got construction of these reactors all around the world, which will bring down time and cost to build.
So just to make sure I understood that, because I haven't heard that explained that way before, one reactor in roughly 11 years, but then you could build 7 other reactors in the following 11 years. That's your view. I didn't heard that explained that way.
Absolutely. And if we look at, for example, countries that, or projects where we have 4 reactors on the same site, what you normally see is the first one comes online when it comes online, and every year thereafter, the next reactor comes online. So that's the intended plan.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. And then, look, you're going to international experiences. I watched the debate between Mr. O'Brien and Mr. Bowen, where he said, look, the coalition's energy plan on nuclear is too ambitious. We're down the track of renewables. When you look around the world, you're starting to talk about all these countries that you have experience in and you've worked in. When you look at Australia versus the ambitions of other countries with how many reactors they're planning on building, how many they have under construction, the timelines they're aiming at, how does that compare, Australia versus the rest of the world?
Yeah, let's take a couple of examples. So if you just have a look at the newcomer nuclear countries, so they are the countries that do not have nuclear today but are planning a build out, there are a number of them that plan by 2035 to have electrons on the grid. The list includes Estonia, Poland, Kenya, Ghana, Uzbekistan, Indonesia, Kazakhstan, and Uganda. They are the newcomer countries. Then if you look at, I just said the US has plans to build 35 gigawatt by 2035. Sweden plans to see 2 nuclear reactors on the grid by 2035 with a build out of 10 reactors thereafter to 2045. And when Sweden is told, well, that sounds ambitious, Sweden says, well, that's exactly the new build that we achieved between the mid-1960s and the mid-1980s. So they just want to replicate what they've done before. Holland plans to see 2 new reactors online by 2035. So, and that's just the start of the list. I could go on, particularly in the established nuclear countries, which are kind of ready to go. So there is a huge momentum globally towards nuclear energy and recognition of the contribution that nuclear energy can play to decarbonised, secure, reliable and affordable electricity grids.
Final question, Mr. Kennedy.
No, look, just a clarification. The coalition policy that I've seen announced is to build 2 reactors by 2037. So that's 2 reactors in the next 12, 13 years. Given you said 1 in 11 and 1 every year after that, that sounds roughly in line with your national experience. It's just a clarification. No need for a long answer there. I just want to make sure I was being clear.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Burnell. Oh, sorry, we'll go to Mr. Chester first.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all witnesses. Just in relation to where Australia currently stands globally, and I'm interested in your comments about perhaps talking Australia down and talking down where our industry's already reached. How would you describe Australia? Do we have a small but highly capable nuclear capability, or where would you describe Australia on the current nuclear spectrum, I guess?
I would describe Australia, in exactly the language that you did. We have a very small but highly respected, highly competent nuclear workforce sitting in ANSTO. We obviously have a highly competent regulator in our PANZA, as well as a regulator in the form of ASNO. So all of our agencies and the way we do things is, it's highly competent, well respected, and Australia internationally has that reputation, and also within our region. We are seen as leaders, globally on topics of nuclear non-proliferation and nuclear security, but also on matters of radiation protection and nuclear safety, particularly in our region. We have de facto status as the representative in our region on the IAEA's Board of Governors. We're a very active participant in the agency's work, and we're very active in the region on topics of nuclear non-proliferation, security and nuclear safety. So we have an excellent international reputation. And having worked internationally, I've been in a lot of rooms and a lot of conferences, and it is actually amazing how many Australians are out there internationally doing work as well. The former Chief Financial Officer, CFO of the Emirates Nuclear Energy Corporation is an Aussie. I know there's an Aussie with a very senior role at the site at Hinkley Point C. There's lots of Aussies out working internationally in the sector who probably would enjoy coming home and working at home as well.
I'd be interested also. Yep, absolutely.
Mr. Parker?
Yeah. I had 37 years as a civil engineer and heavy civil engineering in Australia and internationally on very large dam projects. Australians, the majority of a nuclear power plant is not in fact the nuclear island, it's in fact the civil engineering and mechanical engineering components. This is fairly standard construction with the exception of around about 20% which is pertained to the nuclear island. Given Australia's skill base on civil engineering, we are definitely very well placed to undertake this. And I cite projects such as the LNG plants that were built up in the northwest of Western Australia, which are actually harder projects to build than nuclear power plants. So our civil engineering project management and industry is very well placed to undertake this.
Thank you, Mr. Parker. Just in relation to the capacity constraints, we've heard evidence from some of our witnesses that Australia doesn't have the skill set to develop a nuclear industry. But I was interested, Dr. Abad, you referred to 150 students studying advanced nuclear courses already. Given the timeframes we're talking in the position being put by the coalition, do any witness have any comment to make in relation to our capacity to generate additional skill set in the timelines required?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I can give that a go. Well, it takes about 10 years to train a sort of qualified engineer or nuclear person. It takes about 20 years to train a subject matter expert. So for sure we would be relying on some international expertise in the beginning. But I think this really speaks to my point that procrastination is not really an option, because in order to have an option, we really have to start now with training people and providing experiences to achieve that subject matter expertise.
But could I also mention, please, on that, I've visited in Busan in Korea, King's School, which is the Korean International Nuclear Graduate School. And it was there, of course, they trained most of the operators that went into the UAE project. And that's a course that runs for about 2 years to train operators. Operators do not need to be PhD students, very much like an aircraft pilot does not need to be the designer of aircraft. And a similar metaphor works with nuclear power plants. They're there to do the job as instructed by the manual, but not there to redesign the nuclear power plant. So there are schools around the world, and Ms. Cook could probably mention others, that are in place where our future workforce can be trained.
Thank you. One other point I wanted to go to, we received some evidence from one of the US professors in relation to the active reuse of brownfield sites being retiring coal-fired assets. It was put to us that they were the ideal locations given the proximity of workforce and also access to transmission lines, or at least the transmission corridors. What's the international experience in terms of having a brownfields approach rather than looking at greenfield sites?
Okay, if I could mention a few of the fundamental issues around siting a nuclear power plant. You need to look at seismicity and geological. You need to look at hydrology, namely the availability of water, and you need to be looking at the transmission capability. You need to be looking at transport facilities, and you also need to be looking at an available workforce. One of the great benefits of brownfield sites, specifically if you conservatively size your nuclear power plants going into those, is you can take the same benefit of the existing grid, you can take the same benefit of the existing cooling facilities, and within a nation such as Australia, within the continent of Australia, we have no seismic limitations really on siting of nuclear power plants. So within Australia, and I'll also mention virtually all of those existing coal plants, we had the transport facilities there to take the original generators and transformers to those sites, which are a similar mass to what you'd have in nuclear power plants. So brownfield sites within Australian coal sites lend themselves very well to that transfer, provided we're quite sure that we have the cooling facilities. And by conservatively sizing them, we can make that as well.
And if I could also add, of course, in the United States, one of the advanced reactor demonstration projects being funded by the US Department of Energy is Bill Gates's TerraPower's Natrium reactor, which is being built at a former coal site. So that's a coal to nuclear transition taking place in the United States today. And the US Department of Energy has released a study that it's done identifying 300 coal sites in the US that could go for a coal to nuclear transition in the United States.
Final question. Thank you, Chair, for the indulgence. Helen, thank you for your evidence, particularly in relation to the regulatory framework. This will be sadly a desperate question from a Member of Parliament. What could we be doing to explain the position to Australians better in relation to Australia's capabilities, existing regulatory framework, and our capacity in this area? How do we explain this better to Australian people?
I mean, I think we need to start by explaining that we have a research reactor sitting on the outskirts of Sydney. I think most Australians, unfortunately, are not aware of this, and they're probably also not aware of the tremendous benefit that most Australians either get themselves or know of someone who has had some form of radiomedical isotope treatment for a cancer or some diagnostic testing done with through the use of the benefits of nuclear medicine, and that we have that reactor sitting in, on the outskirts of Sydney. So I think we need to start by talking about, that as a starting point, and then we can build out around that the idea that we have regulated the research reactors that we've had in this country for a very long time, that we are, world leaders on topics, as rated by independent agencies like the Nuclear Threat Initiative out of the United States, that consistently ranks Australia as number 1 or 2 on its assessment of countries and from their non-proliferation standing, their safeguards adherence, and their nuclear security status. So, I think generally talking more about nuclear and actually trying to explain to Australians the benefits and challenges of every energy generation source, and being able to do that freely without being labelled as anti-decarbonisation or anti-renewables because you are pro a contribution of nuclear energy in our mix.
Thank you, Mr. Chester. Mr. Burnell.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for providing evidence today. Somewhat taking off from where you finished off. So, and this is a question to all three, I guess, what is your view of the right mix of nuclear energy? Is it to have what Some people have estimated to be about 4% of the energy mix by 2050. Is it more than that? Number of reactors? I'm keen to get your thoughts.
I might just kick off
Yep.
quickly. The analysis we've been doing, looking specifically at a cost model developed by my colleague, Dr. Robert Barr. We look at, and within that, we try to optimise not only cost but also emissions reductions. And so on that, we look at a base load nuclear mix, which would run in at somewhere about 70%, 75% nuclear, and the remainder would be made up of wind, solar and hydro on the mix. So that would be what we see as the lowest cost situation. I'll come back to the point you made there, that some people are alluding to there being only 4% nuclear would go into the mix. To achieve that, we do need market reform. At present, we have a market which is designed specifically to favour opportunistic provision of energy by variable renewable resources. Okay. And they drive out baseload systems. They do not have those sorts of markets in many jurisdictions globally, and they certainly don't have them, for example, in places like Ontario. So we do need to be looking globally at better models to derive low-cost, efficient, low-carbon generation into our grid, because at present our liberalised energy market is not achieving the results of investment unless you have other subsidies going in on top of it. Price is not the sole driver of entering that market.
Yeah, I
Anybody
mean,
else want to comment?
I could cite some modelling. This is not done by UNSW, actually. This is done by MIT, but the optimum nuclear sort of proportion was 60 to 70% for minimum cost and minimum CO2 emissions. So I think that would be something to work towards, which is essentially like replacing Australian coal with nuclear. But I think the important point of my submission today is that to constrain ourselves by this deadline which we've constructed, I think is perhaps a red herring, and really we should take a very long-term view and work towards that optimal system perhaps beyond 2050. I see no reason not to take that long-term view. And also we need to remember where the other 2/3 of our carbon emissions come from, which is industry. So there are nuclear technologies in development for producing hydrogen, for producing process heat, for thermal processes like making cement, making steel. And that's something that we really have to consider in the long term if we're serious about deep decarbonisation, because currently there are very, very few alternatives to those hard to abate sectors. So in terms of electricity mix, I've given an answer, but I think that question really needs to be broadened out to where our entire energy supply is coming from, because at the moment we really have no answer to that.
Is it, those percentages, you're basing that off the 300 gigawatt projection by 2050, just for clarification, yes?
Yeah. We're finding that sort of percentage works across the mix. And the projection we did in the model we've got starts off with our current situation about 200 terawatt hours, projecting out to about 260 terawatt hours in 2050, and out to about 300 terawatt hours in 2060. So that's the sort of thing. But what we also see is maintaining the level of wind, solar, the renewables. Currently, about where they are, they're about the right fit.
So the reason why I asked that question is that if you go off the lower end, 60%, that's 180 gigawatt of the projected energy need by 2050. 70% is 210, 75% is 225 gigawatt. If we base it on an AP1000 reactor, that's 180 reactors around the country to hit your 60% mark, 210 to hit 70%, or 225 reactors to hit the 75%.
So AP1000.
If you're basing off a 1,000 gigawatt reactor.
It's at 9 terawatt hours per year, and if you've got 180, you're trying to meet at about 20 reactors, I think.
You reckon 20 reactors?
I think you've got...
Yeah, I'm talking about gigawatt hours, not terawatt hours.
Well, terawatt hours. An AP1000 puts out about 9
Right.
a year. And if you're trying to match off against, say, 180 terawatt hours, then you're talking...
So off your calculations, and how many reactors do you think we need to hit 75%?
Based upon about 260 terawatt hours in 2050, 21 gigawatts, about 18 large reactors would do the job.
And can we fit 18 large reactors across the 7 sites that have been proposed? Because the reason why I asked that question is because the actual factual information we've got to go by that's been released by the opposition, they clearly state on page 3 of their document, we have identified 7 locations. These are the only locations in scope, and the coalition has ruled out all other locations. There's nowhere else being considered in the country apart from the 7 listed sites in their policy document. So are we feasibly going to be able to fit those reactors on those 7 sites or not?
The Coalition's current policy is a good first place to start. Would we need to expand those sites based upon 21 reactors, 20 reactors? The answer would be yes. You would need to go further afield.
Right.
I mean, I would have thought Australia's energy consumption will increase in the future as well.
My next question is about SMRs. So, Ms Cook, can you explain to me where commercially available SMRs are available that are operating?
In the Western world, we are currently in the demonstration phase. So, for example,
Where's that?
Yeah. Ontario Power Generation is demonstrating the BWRX 300 reactor by GE. The Dow Chemical Company, together with X Energy, is demonstrating the XE100 reactor. Bill Gates's reactor is under demonstration. So we're in the demonstration phase.
Yeah,
they're not yet commercially available.
I'm not interested in demonstrations. We've been talking about SMRs for 20 plus years coming online. Where are they commercially available in the Western world currently?
They're not.
Okay. So 2 of the sites, the Northern Power Station in Port Augusta and the Mudgee Power Station in Western Australia, they are denoted for SMRs.
They're not commercially available today, but I don't think we're looking at procuring them today. So by the point at which we would be looking to procure them in Australia, based on my understanding, would be later in the 2030s, and the timeframes for the deployment of these demonstration units is either before the end of this decade or very early in the early 2030s. So there could, you asked if they were available now. No, they're not available now. You can get in the order books, and there are many companies and countries that have already placed orders with the reactor vendors. So, you know, getting in the order books is something that is happening right now. But by the time we come to procure, I believe that they could be commercially available.
But they're not available though. Currently they're not available. Everything's a possibility. They haven't been
constructed yet. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bennell. Ms Cook and everyone, thank you for appearing today. You mentioned that the IAEA assessment that a country can progress from initial consideration of nuclear energy to operating its first reactor in 10 to 15 years. Does this factor in Australia's federal and state system, in particular the state's responsibility for energy laws, the consensus approach to the Energy Minister Council's decision making about electricity laws, and the state bans and federal bans on nuclear energy in this country?
The IAEA's roadmap is a generic toolkit that is available to every country. So, of course, it does not look at or address country-specific circumstances. Every country will have its challenges, and every country will have its reasons why nuclear energy will be easier in that country. For Australia, I've already outlined some of the reasons why I think we're in an excellent starting position, and we certainly are not one of those countries that is at the, has to create anything from scratch.
And you've said here that APANS, and they do great work with our medical grade reactor that we have here in this country, and they do great work. And they could have the regulatory framework done within 3 years. Does that include the states and territories and the federal government?
So I've said APANSA, which today has jurisdiction to regulate Commonwealth entities, and I understand this is going to be a Commonwealth program. That today, once the prohibitions are removed, in my opinion, could be ready to receive a construction licence application from a relevant licensee well within a 3-year timeline. They could be ready to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean that the entire regulatory regime is in force, but in my opinion, it could be also in force.
And so you said that you disagreed with Claire Savage's 8 to 10 years for how long it'll take to do the regulatory framework and get the states and territories on board and Australia on board. I just would like to give an example. So you do disagree with that, just to confirm?
I definitely disagree with that, yes.
Okay, so this is just a comment from her. When we did the National Energy Customer Framework, that was literally just developing the rules for retail energy market regulation in Australia, and it involved the Commonwealth and states and territories. I was in government then. We started it in 2004, which was a Liberal national government then, and it was legislated in 2012. Then the legislation began in 2013. Queensland didn't adopt it until 2014, and Victoria never adopted it. Going on that there, just that timeline of a small change in the market, how do you foresee that this could be done in a time frame of less than 8 to 10 years?
First, I think it's a little bit of a sad reflection of how we get anything done in this country, so we might want to take a look at that. But ARPANSA, as I've said, already has a regulatory regime in place, and it draws on, by law, it's required to draw on international best practice. That is taken to mean by ARPANSA drawing on IAEA safety standards. Those safety standards exist today for proven light water reactors, and they're international consensus standards, and Australia is on the committee or the commission that actually prepares and oversees the preparation of those standards. It would be a matter of adopting those standards into the Australian regulatory regime.
So just to go on top of that, how do we get the states and territories on board? Let's just say tomorrow this ban gets lifted federally. How do we get the states and territories on board when that took 8 years and some didn't even accept it?
Nuclear regulation around the world is seen as the purview of the Commonwealth, and under our executive affairs power of the Constitution,
we have a very different situation in Australia.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
quite similar, I think, to Canada, quite similar, I think, to the United States, where they have federal regulators that have jurisdiction, and that jurisdiction covers the field, so that the states, unless they have some agreement with the federal regulators, actually don't do the regulating. It's the Commonwealth equivalent of the Commonwealth agency that does the regulating. The United States Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Canadian CNSC, these are the equivalent of the federal or Commonwealth regulator, has jurisdiction to cover the field when it comes to matters of nuclear non-proliferation, nuclear security, nuclear safety, and nuclear liability, if we were to set up a regime covering that. So I'm saying that ARPANSA, as the federal regulator, has jurisdiction in these areas.
You're aware we currently don't have those options in this country?
Because we have prohibitions, yes.
Yeah, in prohibitions federally and state and territory.
Yes, and I also would think that we have, and this is not obviously my area of expertise, Australian constitutional law. It's not what I practice. I practice international nuclear energy law. But I do understand that we certainly would have excellent lawyers within the Commonwealth government and our administration that should be able to deal with the constitutional issues that arise.
And so my concerns on this are around time frame, as everybody knows by the way I've asked all my questions. I live in the Hunter Valley. I'm an ex-coal miner. To get a coal mine extension on land owned by the coal mine that they're already mining in, takes anywhere from 5 to 8 years just to get that on land they already own. So this is a completely new thing, a new site. So site license, to get a site license to go and start to have a nuclear power station there, how long do you think that'll take?
I have no idea how long it takes to get coal-fired power plants. Anything in relation to them.
Not
that's not
coal-fired
my
power station. It's a coal mine.
Right.
Something that's done regularly in the area. And if we want to use another example, we were talking in South Australia last week. For a uranium mine, it takes up to 15 years to get that to be able to operate there. So how long will it take to get the operational licence to run a nuclear power station in the Hunter, for instance, or anywhere else in this country?
Well, we would proceed along the path that I've identified. First site, then construction licence, then nuclear material arrives and commissioning, and then you apply for your licence to operate when you're at the point of being ready to operate. In my opinion, getting that licence will take as long as the regulator, it takes, and that is not necessarily, and that goes to actually the readiness of the operator itself to operate the plant, as well as the having verified throughout the construction process that the reactor is built according to the approved design. So there's no reason why, if we prepare early and we take the lessons, for example, of the UAE, and we focus on operational readiness early on, that operating license wouldn't be issued at the point where the plant is ready to operate.
Okay, no worries. And you do, so the UAE, I find it hard to use as an example because it is a dictatorship in that country. We don't have that. We have an open discussion here where over there they don't do that. So it's a very different market to be able to compare apples for apples.
Yeah, but that comes back to my point before, that every country will have its things that make it easy to do nuclear, and every country will have its things that are going to make it a little bit challenging to do nuclear. And so if you look at the UAE's starting point, they had one nuclear engineer in the country. They hadn't signed up to most of the treaties and conventions. We have. They didn't have a nuclear law. We do. They didn't have a nuclear regulator. We do. They didn't have any regulations. We do. So just in my area, our starting point is far advanced from where the UAE started, and yet they managed to do what they did. I understand your point that, they're not a democracy and we are, but I actually think you're spot on in terms of what the real obstacle is going to be to rolling out a nuclear energy program on a 10 to 12 year timeline. I think it is political will, and I think a lot of it is going to come down to whether the Australian Labor Party would get behind a democratically elected coalition government and support this, or whether they would do everything to derail and delay and therefore cost more for the Australian taxpayer.
Okay, so
on that, Mr.
Yep.
The point you just raised over the democracy situation. If we look at the history of democratic elected governments and their ability to put nuclear into place, we're seeing currently this issue about the allegation that only dictatorships, for example, can put nuclear on the grid fast. The fastest and almost most industrial miracle that you've got is France. And they built 58 reactors, 63 gigawatts in a 22-year period. And each year of that period, at times they were putting out 6 gigawatts onto the grid. We had the province of Ontario. Ontario is equal to the size of New South Wales plus Victoria. And they built 20 nuclear power plants, about 18 gigawatts, onto their grid in a 20-year period.
If you don't mind me asking, how long were these ago, Mr. Parker?
Oh, probably 30 years ago.
Okay, so a very different time. We're not talking about the same
very
time
different
now.
time.
So it's,
They are
once again, not apples
democracies
for apples.
under the same laws, under the same regimes that we've currently got. And
Okay, thank you.
What we do need is leadership to achieve it.
I just have one final question, and it comes into how Ms Cook asked about Labor's will to this actually happening. So, over 9 years of the opposition being in government, they had 22 different energy policies. Why is now the right time for nuclear when they're not in government? Why are they making that choice now?
I agree with what Dr. Abad said, that it would have been great to do this a lot earlier.
Then why didn't
But
they?
that is not, I can't answer that.
Yeah.
I can't answer that. Maybe because we had prohibitions and that was seen as an obstacle to it.
Same thing
I
we
don't
have
know.
now.
Yes. So now it's time for leadership. Now it's time to take a look at what the rest of the world is doing. Now it's time to get on board and make sure that Australians have the option to have nuclear energy in this country as we deserve, and to do that as quickly as we can.
Yeah, can I add? Citing a deadline as a reason for not doing something is a form of procrastination.
Absolutely.
I will just add the deadline is the issue for me mainly because I'm in the Hunter Valley. We've already had Liddell Power Station come offline. We're about to have Eraring Power Station come offline in the next 2 to 4 years. And then in 2032, we're going to have Bayswater Power Station come offline. What happens to the workforce in the middle of that time when there's nothing for them to go to?
No, I
This
see
policy that they're talking about here, their 5-page policy document, is giving them false hope, saying that they can go from a coal-fired power station working job straight into a nuclear power station job, when they're only going to have 2 facilities built first. That's right, possibly, yeah. That's where my concern is.
No, I see your concern, but on a national level, I think that the government should be able to do 2 things at once. we should be able to build renewables and prepare for a nuclear energy program. The two are not mutually exclusive. And this whole argument seems to be concerned about like weighing up one against the other. I think it's,
Do you agree with
wrong.
Mr. Parker's approach that we need 70% nuclear in the market? Because you said 60%.
we don't need 70% nuclear in the market. Australia needs a nuclear energy capability to survive the future. There's many different ways to get there. We can get there without 70% nuclear in the market, but we cannot face the future that is coming without any nuclear energy.
Thank you
Because
very
I'm
much.
talking about the next 100 years, right?
Thank you very much for your time today. If you've been asked to provide any additional information, including questions on notice, please forward it to the Secretariat by